kinship, and at the same time how this kinship is playing a vital role as a social institutions on par with other social institutions in the society. Now, when we go to the concept of kinship, a kinship is a web of social relationship that form as a essential part of the lives of all humans in our societies. In simple, to understand the kinship determining and the defining who is related to whom, how they are related, and what are their roles, and what are their responsibilities, and what are their behaviors, that is being understood by this kinship. Now let us try to understand what are the types of kinship. When you look at more deeply, we will be able to understand the kinships are framed by blood ties. We call it as consanguineal kinship. Means this is a biological kinship based on common ancestor or blood descent. So kinships are formed through blood ties, the blood relationship. For example, relationship between parents and children, this is called as a blood relationship. And also siblings or grandparents and grandchildren, this is completely a biological bondage will be there among these groups. Then it is called as consanguineal kinship. And the second one is affinal kinship. What is means that? Means this is framed, this is formed with marriage. Means if a person marriage, if a person marry other person, this kind of kinship is formed. For example, it is a through legal or social contract of marriage. When a person legally marry the other person, you will also form certain kinship, certain relationship. That is called the relation. If you take an example, that is the relationship between husband and wife, or in-laws like mother-in-law, like brother-in-law, like sister-in-law, like father-in-law. These are all relationships are formed according to the marriage ties. Then another important type of kinship is social ties. What exactly it tells us? This refers to the relationship that are neither formed or not based on blood or nor marriage, but socially treated as kinship. Means here this type of this type of kinship is also called as fictive kinship. This fictive kinship is formed neither with blood relation or neither with marriage relation. It is completely a social relationship. And now let us try to understand the degrees of this kinship. Kinship also can be divided into different layers based on how close or how distant the relationship is. For example, we call it as a primary kin. Means direct or and immediate relatives. For immediate and directive relatives, we call them as a primary kin. Means there are 8 types of primary kins are there. For example, father, mother, husband, wife, son, daughter, brother, sister. These people comes under primary kin. And other than this, for example, if you want to know about the kinship more, we need to study also secondary kin. The primary kin of your primary kin, who will be called as a secondary kin. Means the primary kin of your primary kin. For example, it is classified into, there are 33 secondary kins are there. For example, grandfather is called as a secondary kin, maternal uncle is also called as secondary kin, and also stepmother is also called as secondary kin. Here primarily we need to understand the secondary kin is a person, is a primary kin to your primary kin. And the next one is tertiary kin. means the primary kin of your secondary kin. We have thought that certain people called as a secondary kin. Whoever is a primary kin to that secondary kin is called tertiary kin. And sociologists and anthropologists have identified 151 tertiary kins are there. For example, great grandfather, cousin's wife, brother-in-law's son. These are the people who are treated as, means little longer relatives, little longer or distant kinship is there. They are called as tertiary kin. And one more important aspect we need to learn from this lesson is lineage and descent. How society traces ancestry determines a descent system. For example, we have couple of things to understand here, that patrilineal descent means tracing the lineage and inheriting property exclusively through the father's male line. This is called patrilineal descent. And one more point we need to understand in this kinship is matrilineal descent, means tracing the lineage and inheriting property exclusively through the mother's or female line. Sometimes we have bilateral descent, means tracing the lineage through both the mother and father lines equally is called bilateral. And now we need to understand the importance of kinship in our society. Means kinship is not just about the family tree and the people around in relatives. It is there is a role by the kinship to provide. For example, socialization and care. It determines who is responsible for raising the children, caring the children and elderly people, and passing down, and taking ahead the family or the society, etc. So it derives the cultural values also. And one more important point to understand here with regard to kinship is that inheritance and property. It is established, because of this kinship, it establishes legal rules regarding who inherits family property or wealth or a social society. So hence this kinship is very much important. And regulation of marriage. Kinship rules define who an individual can marry, whether it is exogamy or endogamy, or the types, the rules, regulation is also formed in the kinship. Who they cannot marry, for example, they can differentiate between exogamy and endogamy. So that is the reason it regulates the marriage. And social support. For example, in the times of crisis, in the times of conflict, or in the case of economic hardship, the kinship group act as built in safety net and support them. Means what? For example, if the family or a group is in crisis, definitely the people who are in kinship, they come together, they support each other, and they they present their unity at the time if there is any conflict. And in villages also we will see that because of the kinship, they share the work at some times, they share the labor at this time of their agriculture work, or also at the time of certain social functions. Thank you.